The chauffeur. Can you guess the last line of this story? Mrs. Winterly was a very rich woman. Her husband was a multimillionaire. She was quite young, but he was quite old. She was 28. He was 58. They lived in a very large house in England. Mrs. Winterly never cooked or cleaned the house. She never worked and she never drove a car. When she wanted to go anywhere, she would call Charles. Charles was her chauffeur. Mr. Winterly traveled a lot. He flew to many countries to do business. Mrs. Winterly did not like to fly, so she often stayed at home. Once Mr. Winterly went to America for a week. Mrs. Winterly decided to go shopping, so she walked to the garage to find Charles. She found him in his room above the garage. Mrs. Winterly looked at him and said, "Charles, take off my hat." "Certainly, madam," Charles replied. Then he took off Mrs. Winterly's hat. "Charles, take off my coat." "Certainly, madam," Charles replied. Then he took off Mrs. Winterly's coat. "Charles, take off my shoes." "Certainly, madam," Charles replied. Then he took off Mrs. Winterly's shoes. "Charles, take off my dress." "Certainly, madam," Charles replied. Then he took off Mrs. Winterly's dress. Mrs. Winterly looked into the eyes of her chauffeur and said,